Oceanigata, Jeff Ganolito Corntassel Dagwadoa, Shalagi Yetli Iguena Sai. So my name is Jeff Corntassel, and welcome to another episode of Frontlines Are Everywhere, the podcast that looks at Indigenous self-determination and Indigenous internationalisms across Turtle Island and beyond. And I'm really honored to have Angela Grier today as our guest. And so I'm going to read a short bio and then go right into our questions. So Angela, welcome. Thank you for being on our podcast. Angela is from Piikani Nation, or Blackfoot, with over 25 years experience working directly with First Nations and Indigenous peoples and communities on both sides of the border. And with a master's in education and counseling psychology, Angela is a registered provincial psychologist residing in her traditional territory, Mohkinstsis, otherwise known as Calgary, and she also holds the Indigenous Initiatives lead for the Canadian Counseling and Psychotherapy Association for its national office, as well as being the first Indigenous board member for the Parkland Institute. Angela has been working and supporting First Nations and Indigenous peoples through direct and systemic experiences, including Indigenous psychology and counseling, Indigenous and child youth rights advocacy, adult education, post-secondary, elected leadership, extensive executive experience, nonprofit, public administration, and Blackfoot ways of knowing. Her graduate research explored Indigenous psychology from a Blackfoot experience and embodiment. Angela is a proud Pecan First Nation member and a mother of four and a grandmother to Meadow. So Wado, thanks, Angela, for being on the podcast today. And would you like to introduce yourself to the audience?
It's so good to be here. Oki, nisto netani ko payok sabanski, ni tutua potsipikani ni siksikates to be. So I just introduced myself, said hello, my relatives, that I'm singing Loudly Far Away is my spiritual name, and it was gifted to me when I was 14. And usually as Blackfoot women, we don't generally change our names. Sometimes the men do, but we usually keep our names for life. So this is me until the next lifetime, and I'm from the Piikani Nation of the Blackfoot Confederacy.
And just to start, so this is kind of a broad question, and you can jump into it any way you want, but we have Indigenous nations from all across Turtle Island, across the Americas, across Asia, and these nations, you know, these some 5,000 plus nations have trade networks, have their own protocols and diplomacies, they have their own activism, they have their own ways of knowing and being. And in that sense, we're calling it Indigenous Internationalism, this kind of broad perspective. What does that term resonate with you? What does that term mean for you?
Absolutely. I mean, we as a confederacy are on the border of, United States and Canada, is what known as today as United States and Canada. Those are our Blackfoot territories. And so we have sort of a similar situation like the Mohawks out east, right? And so the Confederacy is in both countries. So the border, we refer to it as a medicine line because, one day our ancestors were out there hunting in the north and they were going to go home, and next thing they couldn't go back home. And so it's this magical thing that was our ancestors, couldn't understand. And of course, that was trauma in itself. And we still have people who are not allowed to come across the border to participate in our ceremonies, which is a total infringement of our fundamental rights. So the work on the border is really important to me. When we look at sort of our historical artifacts, we have Mexican pottery we've found in our communities that has been ancient. We've found the tiny horse that was, shared from a long time ago. So we have remnants of this this international highway and commerce and economy that we participated in and still do. I'm always about enacting our sovereign economies and forgetting about Canada and Alberta and et cetera, and just doing our thing because we have that right. And I'd like to see them try and stop us once, because we'll always win in court. We always will. That's the interesting thing about these politicians is they don't understand their laws, right? We actually uphold a lot of their laws. So that means a lot to me. I think it's not an us issue, the border. I think it's a them issue. I think for us as First Nations, we have the Jay Treaty in our neck of the woods that honors our people to go down south and work and live based on, that advocacy of our ancestors. But I'm actually an American. Don't hold it against me. And I was born in Washington, as my family would go down there a lot and harvest fruits and pick, at the farms for a living way back in the day. And I happened to be down there. My mom was pregnant, and there's a few of us born over there in Washington. So, I get to cruise pretty freely, and I always love challenging the border, but it's a real pain for us. That border really causes a lot of difficulties. And that's why I really encourage those sovereign approaches to just do what we have to do to bypass these things, because, that's what sovereignty is. So it does resonate a lot for me.
Yeah, I would for that. And I'm, I was born in Long Beach, California. So, and then, a lot of Cherokees headed to California in the 1930s. So that's where I was born, from Oklahoma. So I can't hold it against you. I always say I'm Cherokee first and foremost, and who happens to be U.S. citizen. So thank you for that. And has there been a lot in your experience of difficulty or challenges, especially around visiting family, traveling for ceremony, when you cross that medicine line?
It's pretty traumatic what we have to go through. Our Confederacy, our leadership have worked really hard with our incorporated body, the Blackfoot Confederacy. They're doing a lot of good work now, and we've had to go in and give lists of elders who had bundles, don't open them, don't touch them. And we have to pray for those people who breach those protocols, because things are going to happen to them and their families, right? And they don't talk about that side of things. I don't know if they believe it, but we know what happens when you breach those protocols. So we actually pray for people who make mistakes with us, right? Because they're gonna reap that karma. So it is a very traumatic thing to go through. You remember my ex Scott, and we have our child together. And so we've had to do a lot of cross-border during our relationship. Now that Roy gets to go down south on his own, sort of jump on the train and head over to Fort Peck. But we still go through challenges at the border almost every time. It's a very traumatic experience for me when I pull up. And it's always surprising when it's usually coming back into Canada. It's pretty bad. It is really traumatic. And like I said, there's people who have never got to see our big camp, our big Sundance. And to me, that's heartbreaking. Like, that's wrong. Like, it's devastating when I think of the challenges that border has done to us. And, we're trying to get more of our people to work there, and we keep educating them. Of course, Cardston is right on the blood tribe, right borders the American-Canadian border. So same with Bigunni, our tribe is cut in half because of that border, my tribe in Bigunni. So it's been hard on us. It's been a lot of trauma, I'll say.
Absolutely. And it seems almost like there need to be some reparations made for all that trauma, maybe the bundles that have been taken, or the inability of families to connect, right, to ceremony and things like that. My dream is kind of almost like a nexus lane for Indigenous peoples, where we have our own lane, and we speak with Indigenous border guards, or whatever we want to call them,
We're not the threat. Hello, we're protecting our lands. We're not the
Exactly.
threat.
Exactly. We have work to do, we have lots of things to exchange and, ceremonies to take part in, and don't have that time to be harassed at the border.
Yeah, ceremonies are a big part of our international highway and relations. We go and we exchange things together, we smoke pipe together, and we do all sorts of things together across Indian country to commemorate our governance systems and our ways of life, our existence. So, that ceremony is everything to us. And yet it's actually prohibited still, it feels like, when we
Yeah.
cross those borders.
Yeah, it seems to be a lot of lip service to it, but not the actual tangible support for those ceremonies. Like you said, people touching the bundles or breaching protocol, right?
Traumatizing kids.
Yeah.
Kids watching this stuff, they're scared. I've seen them in the border office crying and scared. And, sometimes those officers are so dismissive. Sometimes they're very cruel and mean. They're like cops, you know, like as if we don't matter, as if we're not seen as people.
Well, kind of shifting gears and focusing on some of the work that you do, and you do so much. I was reading that out and thinking, wow, you do it all. Uh, what are some of, we're just fresh back from the 10th anniversary of the Buffalo Treaty signing. And that's where, you know, that Buffalo Treaty was signed, 10 years ago with Blackfoot Nations. And I was thinking, who are some of your influences? Who are some of the people that you've admired and have inspired you to do the work that you do today?
I was thinking about that last night, reading the questions, and it was so big. Real quick, a side note, on the bio, I'm not at the national office for CCP anymore. I'm actually on the board.
Oh, excellent. Okay. Excellent.
Sort of they recruited me to be the Indigenous board member, and I'm like, okay, if you're asking for it. So I'm like,
be careful what you
I
wish
just
for.
told them last week, I'm putting in a lot of motions coming up, so be prepared, right? My mother, first and foremost, she's not here anymore, and it's been about 15 years since she's been gone next month. And she was my little, I was, of course, as a daughter, that's my role model, that's my hero. And she was, one of the first educated, post-secondary educated people in our community. She was a professional. She built a lot of the capacity with Dr. Cindy Blackstock for the reforms that are going on now. And Cindy, every time we meet, I run into Cindy, she'll always acknowledge my mom still. And she talked about when she won the first that human rights case for the kids way back when. And she told me, I walked across the bridge and I said, Sandy, we did it. She called out to my mom. And so, of course, my mom was everything. And my mom was a woman of service. She really loved our family and our community, and she never left. She never left. And she built up that space in our community within child welfare to keep kids home, to keep kids aligned with culture. So she was a real pioneer, right? She would consider herself a rebel against the church, right? She would talk about her experiences in residential school and how she had to overcome them, and just always sharing her stories. So she was very fundamental. Of course, my children, everything's for them and the future of our young people. And of course, with, Dr. Leroy Little Bear and Amethyst First Rider, those are my custom adopted parents in Blackfoot. And they adopted me over 20 years ago. And since then, we've just had the best time, right? We've had so much fun working together, and his mentorship, taking me under his wing and supporting me to be work as an Indigenous person and it's a to be person in psychology. He really encouraged that. He's actually a big fan of psychology, believe it or not. So, there's a lot of people, including my elders, the elders back home, who are the Jedis. I consider them the Jedis. And, you and I, we know the history of pirates and Jedis. And, they're definitely huge influences. People like yourself and Tayagi, those were big role models that in leadership that I saw didn't have any fear to put these things out there. And being around people who are courageous, it's necessary because we get scared. We're humans. These are natural emotions we have. So being around a lot of fearless leaders in my community, out in the world and Indian country, I think those are some of my biggest influences for this road that I walk.
Yeah, that is a tough one. It's always being, worried about leaving someone out, or, and I could think of, and then if we went through non-human kin, we could go on for days too with buffalo and yeah.
Yes, the ancestors. I mean, geez, it's on. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, what up for that? Uh, Kind of getting at your work, but you've supported and strengthened a lot of Indigenous peoples through your work in counseling and promoting mental health. And what are some of the biggest challenges that you see today? I mean, I consider mental health to be really a crisis, and especially since the pandemic, it's become more notable, but it's kind of a silent crisis. People don't talk about it. They don't often uh, focus on it or shed light on it, or even give it much credence as an important thing to understand. So, what are some challenges that you see today in community or in the work that you do?
There's a lot. Of course, for us in our communities, we're always shortchanged on the funding, right? We never get what the municipalities get or the provinces. There's just so many barriers we face with that. But right now, the opioid crisis is really kicking our communities' butts. And it's to me, it was really perpetuated by the doctors. We would have kids who would go in with their cameras and record the session with the doctor, say in a place like Cardston, and the doctors would just be dishing out like 100 opioids for headaches or something like that. So you look back at the studies of early psychology that talked about, if you can addiction, and if you have nothing sort of happening to stimulate the senses of the people, the addiction rates increase. If you have, recreation, and you have all sorts of other things in place, the rat study, famous rat study using cocaine, the rats that didn't become addicted to the cocaine had a whole amusement park. So they were busy, they were doing their thing, they were living their life. And the rats that didn't have anything except just the cocaine water, they just became totally addicted, right? So I don't want to, I'm not saying that we are rats. I'm just referencing that study because it was an important one to demonstrate sort of some of the things we're dealing with now. Like I said, the lack of funding, the lack of being a priority in this country. That's why I always say they must look at us like we're not human, like we're subhuman. We don't deserve this equity, this health equity. We don't deserve these resources because they're there. And we saw it in COVID. Talk about COVID. You saw the money fly, right? You saw everything was there. And somehow when that crisis is over, well, there's no money again. Okay, so we know that there's lies. COVID was so important for uncovering so many truths, right? Whether it was the land healing, the animals coming back into spaces they've never been in for decades, all that good stuff. So we got a good load of data in COVID, but with our communities of crisis they are not our traditional communities. These are communities of colonization. This is active colonization. And the opioid crisis, the meth crisis, we're just seeing it come into our communities. And I know it's been happening in the States for a long time, but it was really perpetuated by the health system here. And so when you have a system like that, that's perpetuating that institutional violence, and we're going to them for help, you can see how things start to get out of control. That is why, it's so important to have practitioners like myself who are of these communities, being a part of these solutions, being a part of these discussions. Our politicians are not mental health providers. We have to support our leadership to understand more the dynamics of this. I've been working with our communities for a long time, and I remember back home working with the employment center, and we would always sit around and talk about why people aren't holding the jobs, why we're offering these things and they're not coming in the droves that we hope they are. And we're putting the cart before the horse. You cannot get somebody to be sustainable in work if their mental health and if their life is devastating and they're reeling in the impacts of intergenerational trauma and residential school survivors and their children. I am a residential school survivor, or a child of a residential school survivor. And my parents, my grandparents all went, or they were all stolen and put in those institutions, taken. So right now we're having another mental health crisis with, sort of the graves that we're uncovering. We're having to peel back more trauma and get more in touch with that. And how much resources do we have around the table? And I don't believe that mental health alone is everything. I completely believe and support that we need our spiritual supports at the table as well. We need our elders, we need our ceremonialists, we need our transferred knowledge holders, because we are not going to get out of this with just our traditional resources alone, because these are modern day problems. We need modern day solutions as well as our traditional capacity. So it creates a difficult dynamic because that system we're still all working out, right? And I'm really grateful to be Blackfoot because our ceremonies, you came to the territory, you saw the songs, you saw the language, you saw the community come together. We're still very connected, but the mental health barriers keep us apart. So they keep people apart, and it affects everything. Kids can't go to school if they're coming to school and they just listened all night to parents fighting or stuff going on in the home. That's really scary because of mental health issues. I work with youth in each one of my 3 First Nation clinics that I work with, and I hear the same stories over and over. But the kids still got to go back home, right? And we can't change those homes. We only have this hour a day, at times a week, to try and shift things. But I do believe in the ability to shift trajectory of people's lives with counseling. I've seen it. I've worked with young people who said, I didn't plan to live till 25. I was going to die by then. And now I'm planning a life, right? And they're like, thanks a lot, Angela. And now I have to plan all these things. And, there's sort of sarcasm, but that's what we're dealing with. We're dealing with people who have the highest suicide rates in the world. We're dealing with people who have the limited resources in the country. We're in third world conditions at times. So all of this, how do you even survive these conditions? I look at our communities as war zones sometimes, just trying to survive these spaces, let alone impact and shift mental health trajectories. So we've got a lot to work on. It's a very tough answer to sort of, sum up. But I do know that with our spirituality and our cultures, there's so much healing there. People get to have family there. They don't have to be your blood relative. You can get healing. The men sweat together and they talk to each other and they're with each other and they support each other. The women have their space too and so forth. So it's a very healing space, and we have to get back to that spiritual revolution.
The next question was how are we overcoming this? But I think I might blend it with the Buffalo Treaty. It seems like ceremony, and you kind of alluded to this, ceremony is one of the keys to our healing, and it always has been in a lot of ways. But these are also modern problems. So how does the Buffalo Treaty kind of come into play here in terms of reestablishing that relationship to Buffalo for youth and for elders and for other folks, and maybe community healing?
It encompasses all that. I was very fortunate to be the 5th signatory in 2014 on the Buffalo Treaty. And I was there as a member of the Piikani Nation Chief and Council. I was sort of thrown in at last minute. I did not expect to be thrown into the pipe ceremony or anything. I wasn't prepared. I was just showing up, waiting for our acting chief to show up. And because that person was late, they're like, get in there. And I'm like, oh my gosh. It was meant to be. I was so grateful and I loved it. It was so historic. And the power of resurrecting a treaty relationship, a sovereign treaty between our First Nation people, that to me was powerful. That was healing. That was something we need to see, right? We need to bring that into our consciousness, that power, that sovereign action, that responsiveness. And of course many people helped to build that treaty, but again, Dr. Little Bear, Ihkeskini, his Blackfoot name is Lowhorn. He really put his heart and soul in this, right? And again, it's our cultures are land-based cultures, so we are really relevant to the spaces we're in. That's why I really reject pan-Indianism, the cultural melting pot, because it erases us. It erases us as a people. I'm not Cree, I'm not Salish, I'm not Kootenai, I'm Blackfoot. That's all I know. I can't speak for the other people. They have to speak for themselves. So this Buffalo Treaty gives us a shared language and a shared platform that we all can come together on, but still stay unique in our own identities. Like you said, your work with the Cherokee Nation is going to be really important from that perspective. And we're going to learn lots from each other by standing in our identities and not this sort of melting pot, right? But the Buffalo Treaty, the healing, it actually cites the articles in the treaty speak to pretty much everything of our existence. It even includes the research aspect, right? It's pretty cool. It's a pretty dope treaty. The healing aspect, we have to have the things we need for our body to be well. And we know the colonial diet and foods, even the beef, is filled with steroids and lots of not good things. They eat grass that's full of pesticides, so we're very disconnected from our organic selves. We need that buffalo back. We're not beef people, and our elders always talk about you are what you eat. And those cows are, what do? They just follow each other around. They don't know what to do. They lie around. They don't do anything. They're kind of dumb. Whereas our buffaloes, we can't even fence those guys in. They're vibrant and they're running through the lands and they break through barriers, and that's who we were. That's our spirit, right? And that animal represents everything to us, because for time immemorial, it gave us our food, our clothing, our shelter, and we honor it. It gave us spirituality as well. It gave us gifts from the spirit world, the Buffalo people. So it's everything to us, right? It's a part of our genetic makeup. So we got to tap into that. And I do believe when we have buffalo in our diet, it has its own healing, mechanisms on its own for the body. You really feel it. You feel the difference when you eat buffalo versus beef. And it's bringing together a lot of people. It's bringing together not only the science community, but it's bringing our elders back into these conversations of, like you said, you got to find those buffalo stories. That's our library. That's our data. We don't write things down. We store it in songs and stories, and we transfer it in different ways. It's not all written, right? Because it has to be protected. And I'm glad it's not written, because some things aren't meant to be shared outside of our communities, those sacred spaces. So the healing of the treaty, I think we haven't seen, we've saw a lot of healing, I think, of it bringing people together across our lands to start. And then I think the specific healing in the communities is what we're going to see some of the next steps being, and the enactment of those articles within the treaty. So just like we're reaching to TRC, UNDRIP. I guess those are very controversial now. But we're utilizing these articles to promote our rights and to stand within our rights and to be sovereign. So I think it's a very powerful tool in itself, very sacred.
Yeah, and I witnessed some of that. I was fortunate enough to witness some of that, and I didn't realize you were the fifth signatories. That's pretty special.
Oh, I thought it was.
Uh, and fifth of I think was it 8 original signatories? Blackfoot.
Yeah, it wasn't just Blackfoot chiefs. We actually had chiefs. I know Tutino was there. I think Fort Peck was there. So there was a mixture of different people, different communities who were right there at the start. Our local prairie, kind of the prairie neighbors to Blackfoot territory were invited, and some showed up and some weren't able to. But it's an amazing how much this thing's grown. Like it's just it's powerful because the buffalo spirit's behind it, right?
I think I've lost count, but probably over 50 signatories now in 2024, easily, after what we just witnessed. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, Watto for that. I remember you leading the Buffalo Dialogue in one of the teepees, and we're talking about loss and resilience. And one of the things that you said is when we're confronted with loss as Indigenous peoples, we'll pray it back. And I thought that was such a powerful way to express things. Often the anthropologists use the language of extinction. They're always talking about how language is dying out. There's always this emphasis on things going by the wayside or not being there anymore. And I think that's such a different message of praying it back, right? We can renew, we can recover, we can find different ways to bring these practices back into our daily lives. So I was wondering what that, that's how I took that message, but I was wondering how you interpreted that and how you felt about that.
My good friend Nadine, good striker tail feathers, who said that to me way back in the day when we were going to university together. And of course, when you go to university, you just sit around as natives and you just think about how you're going to save the world, right? It's kind of a coming of age thing, right? But we were having one of those moments, creative moments, and we were feeling down about stuff. And she said, and she's always been a very spiritual, traditional woman. I do believe she's part of the Motogeek. She's just a really incredible person, and still works with her community. So she talked about that it's okay. Like we're going through the flux. We're going through all these evolutionary changes, basically. And, our ancestors are waiting there. They're waiting for when we're ready to connect. And we really believe that from a spiritual sense that it makes our ancestors happy when we pray. They give back to us through many ways, many pathways. They come back into this universe. So it's still a reciprocal relationship. It's still a relationship with them. It's just a spiritual one now. It's just not a physical one as we have here, like you and I talking today. So they're still there, and they're like an army waiting for us to tap in, right? Waiting for us, our people, to pray together, be prayer people again. I think as people are becoming more aware of our, sort of the imposed religion trauma that we've gone through, that sort of religious trauma. They're becoming more aware of how they feel about things. We still have a lot of people who practice both Christianity and Blackfoot ways. So it's still around, and it's still people are. That's up to everybody to sort of figure out. And I just think that the history of Christianity upon us as First Nation people has been a very traumatic experience, and the sort of the spiritual guardians that were sent into our communities were sent in a way that connected to our spiritual being, that we're very spiritual people. And those entities that were sent in as spiritual guardians from, say, the Christian colonial perspective, that was a very difficult relationship. And so I get that where people are, it's a spectrum of healing, of decolonizing our spirits. I think it's a very real thing. I dedicated my entire thesis to that, for my psychology, because I couldn't really pick any schools of thought in psychology that I could really jump into. A lot of the ones that were leaning towards sort of indigenous thought, they had actually stolen knowledge from us, right? And claimed it as their own. So, Maslow, Young, it just goes on. So, still happening today. So, that's why protecting our spaces and our knowledge is really important. But with the reason I chose that is because every time I went through difficult things, it was the smudge, it was the prayers, it was the ceremony that brought me back in line and picked me up off the ground. Right. And of course, I've had an amazing therapist for years, and, we're encouraged to have that as practitioners because we're taking in so much energy, right? A lot of this energy can be considered spiritual energy too, as we're trying to deconstruct these colonial imprints that are upon us and having to understand that. So, prayer, spirituality is a really important aspect of who we are. It's why we're still alive.
Yeah.
When everything was, I shared with you sort of the Cole's notes of the Iniskim story of that was a time where we prayed for the buffalo to come forward. And it's a very powerful story, and we manifested that. So I do believe we're here based on the prayers of people before us, of the people who are still praying for us right now back home. I always say I ride on the coattails of their prayers. I know I should be more active. I should be doing lots of stuff, but I also know that there's core groups of people back home praying for people like you and I, praying for us and our success to overcome adversaries for our people, for the people, right? And we're always reminded of that. And it's important to have that in our lives because these problems here on earth are much bigger than any of us can handle. They're so complex. There's a spiritual warfare, I believe, out there as well at times, and I do know that mental health is necessary to address people who are carrying our spiritual bundles and our spiritual ways, because they have to be well to think clear. I see my role as a psychologist very much the same way. I stayed away from the practice for a long time because I was grieving. I was going through a lot in my life. I didn't feel well. I didn't feel grounded. And then finally I got fed up and I'm like, I'm done with these, I'm done with these kind of work I'm doing. I need to do what I was trained for. And it just came one day and everything fell into in its path, everything aligned. So it was waiting for me to be in the right place because it wasn't working out before. Right. And that's what we believe is when things work out, it's because that's a spiritual path that's been opened up for us. And it's a part of that. It's protecting us. So we're walking around protected, doing this work. I couldn't do this work alone, right? My elders worry about me. They know what I do. I show up to ceremony and they're like, I don't even say anything when I get painted. They're like, yeah, we prayed for you in the work that you do. We know that you're working with people, da 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 da. So they already know. They're already looking out for me and thinking about me, right? And I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for any of that. It wasn't for any of our spiritual practices, that smudge that cleanses me and supports me and protects me. So we are spiritual beings in a human body, and this is just our one journey we're on. We have many, I believe we have a lot to go, and none of us really know what happens on the other side. But I'm not going to challenge that. I have deep faith. We were raised, with a lot of, and even that word faith has that connotation, Christian connotation. And that's why the language, English language, is like, faith is not about Christianity. It is about you and your relationship, your spiritual relationship, I believe, and how it manifests within you. So we sort of have to show up in a good way to those spiritual places and spaces, and it will work in the way it's supposed to. But if we're just showing up and saying, "Oh yeah, do your thing, heal me, do what I needed you to prove it, you prove this thing to me," that's not how it works, right? We almost have to prove ourselves. We have to bring it has to come from the heart. You have to meet halfway with this stuff. You can't just be passive in life and expect, these amazing things to happen. We have to put in the work on our human side. We're not getting a free ride here. And that's why in Blackfoot we call it Nitsitapisini. It's a way of life. It's not showing up on a Sunday. It's not, confessing and we're all good. I'll continue to do crazy bad things, right? It's a way of life. We have a lot of accountability to each other in our communities that keep us in line, right? And humility and being small in that way is a very spiritual place to be, because if we get too big, we start detaching from spirit and we become ego. We become cut off at the head and cut off from the heart, right? So we have to be that whole person to navigate these really complex environments. And just counseling alone or a few things alone, it's just not enough, at least not for me. Sometimes I feel I need an exorcism. A colonial exorcism, and I know that it's a very important thing for people to stand on, because our relationship in the spirit world is ours and ours alone. And we got to figure out what that looks like, each and every one of us. But we're lucky when we've got cultures that are solid to guide us through those things, toward those things.
I almost think that maybe that's what decolonization at the spiritual level is. It's like an exorcism, like getting out those other negative spiritual paths and beings. Yeah, so important.
It is, because when I mentioned religion and spirituality are two different things. Religion is man-made. It's literally man-made. The woman is not a part of this. The woman is actually demonized. She's looked down at. I mean, Adam and Eve, for crying out loud. Eve has been demonized, etc. So I can't identify with any of that. That doesn't make sense to me. The sky beings, the water beings, the land beings, that makes sense to me, right? And we pray to those beings because we don't pray to a single deity. We don't have that understanding. That's like an all-knowing power, all-knowing knowledge. That's a very colonial structure of the answers are only here and here alone, right? And it's changed, that covenant has changed over centuries, millenniums, from the original doctrine that might have been really holy, probably was. I don't know much about, I wasn't raised as a Christian. I wasn't raised in the church. I was a heathen. I was a savage, I guess, to those standards. But I'm okay with that. Like I feel very grateful my mom made that conscious choice to do that for us, for me at least. And but our spirituality is rooted in nature. It's rooted in the animals that gave us gifts because they felt sorry for us. And we always have to remember where we came from, and we are less than the animals. We're not above them. We are, the natural world could live without us and it'll actually flourish. We cannot live without the natural world, right? We can't. And we're seeing that now. I hope, like, how much catastrophe does people need to see in this globe before they're going to get on the frickin' green train and start doing something about climate, right? It's like, how much more do you need to know? How much more devastation do you want? Like our people we know nature. We have winter counts. We have our way of documenting history, and we know a lot of these things are not normal, right? And we're the ones who suffer because we are the land-based cultures. And that's why I think a lot about my Northern brothers and sisters, the Inuit people, because they're still so living off the land. And they're being so devastated in many ways with the herds and the fish and everything. So even out in the West Coast, the salmon issues, right? It hurts me to think our people can't access their natural way of life because we've gone through that. Our buffalo has been severed from us. So a part of our spirit is still not intact. And getting this Buffalo Treaty helps us start to restore our full self and our full being. So it is a very spiritual way of life. In Blackfoot, we call ourselves Nitsitipi. It means human beings or the real people. And most people have a name that sort of says that same thing. And our culture teaches us how to be human beings, right? Our prayers have the instructions for life. And we need to get back and understand those things and really start dissecting it and taking apart. And that was my thesis. It was about looking at the prayer, Blackfoot prayer. I've got the approvals. I worked with, transferred knowledge holders who had the authorities to speak on these things. And I just took their stuff. I'm just a conduit, right? That's not my knowledge. It's not theirs. It's all of ours. But we have sanctified empirical ways of doing as well. And one of the ways is they're the only ones who can speak on that. So it gets pretty deep. I love it. Psychology is deep, spirituality is deep, our people are deep. We're used to this stuff. We're used to being in intense conversations and spaces. And we need our spirits to be strong so we can stay in those spaces. Because this stuff ain't easy. This is not easy work.
No, it's not. I can't even imagine. Yeah, thank you so much for that. A couple thoughts. I have a friend, Henrietta Mann, who's a Cheyenne Sundance woman, and one of her quotes that I always use is, "We're not humans seeking a spiritual path. We're spiritual beings seeking a human path." And I think at our core, everything that underpins us as Cherokees, as Blackfoot, as different nations, is that spirituality. And like you said, it's not religion. It's connection, it's relationship. Having lots of experience in the church as a kid, it was fear-based, and a lot of the intimacies that were expressed there were in a building. So you had to go to a building to express these innermost thoughts, versus I think an Indigenous or Cherokee perspective is, it's the land itself, it's the connections to the plant nations, the animal nations, the kin. So yeah, thank you for that. That's so important, and that's our worldview. That's our perspective, or one of our perspectives.
I mean, I've watched our societies grow. They're revitalizing. There's lots of young people coming back. And when we see these young people get connected to their core identity, their core resources of the culture and some ceremonies, they're bulletproof. Nothing's knocking these people down. And that is why spirituality was such a threat to the original colonizers. They didn't want us to pray because they knew that's our strength, right? So now that we have freedoms again, sort of, kind of, we're seeing our youth go toward that, which is so beautiful. And it's so organic and natural because this is what we prayed for. Generations prayed for this, right? So we can pray things back to the original. We do pray things back. We are a product of prayers, Jeff. Right now, right here, doing this wonderful show you're doing, and this is a product, a manifestation of our ancestors, that we would not get left behind, that we will continue to evolve, we will continue to conquer our adversaries, we will continue, period.
Love it. Yeah, and you brought it all back to praying it back. And yeah, I think I've heard the phrase, we're our ancestors' wildest dreams. And I think of, with these kinds of conversations, this is what should be happening. This is what has been prayed or willed into being. So yeah, thank you for that. I'm going to shift gears a little bit, but it's really tied into this. I was thinking of, so as a Cherokee man, I grew up not being encouraged to express my emotions, except for maybe anger. So not to be vulnerable, not to show grief. And I'm holding my heart because, we're often, that's where a lot of those emotions are held. And so I was encouraged to speak more from here. And so I was thinking of the work that you're doing and how important emotions are to really honoring our ancestral ties, but also praying and living. And so I was wondering what, I was thinking of emotions that some have been written about, like anger and resentment, and, their role in Indigenous resurgence by, folks like Coulthard and Rachel Flowers and others. But I was thinking, even grief isn't fully discussed or written about, from an Indigenous standpoint. Not that it has to be written about, but, these are emotions that are so important to our everyday lives. And so I was wondering if you could talk about maybe what does it mean for you to almost in a sense decolonize emotions, or the ways that we talk about emotions. I know that's another big question.
Yeah, no, yeah, you like those big questions. I think that I've started to sort of say that emotions are the language of the spirit, right? Because what we know, and I'll talk a little bit as a clinician here, um, our emotions are the realest gauge we can honor. So you talk about people's instinct, intuition, often dismissing it, but they're emotions coming up in the body. Our body doesn't lie, right? Our mind does, our thoughts do. They can be little tricksters, right? But the thoughts aren't always the truth. We attach a thought to an emotion and we assume that is why the emotion is happening. And that's one of the biggest gems I can give to people is do not act out on your emotional based behavior. Don't make decisions when you're emotional. Allow your emotions to just run through you. And then you will come to some clarity once your brain gets back into its normal form and it's not detached from the prefrontal cortex, which is our primary decision maker, and the one that is the critical analysis. Because when we're emotional, that part of our brain is not working. It can't, because through evolution, if we when we're emotional, we go into fight, flight, or freeze. Okay, that's just normal. There's a whole brain situation that happens, the oxygen levels. There's just a lot. People can Google brain and behavior and emotions in the brain. You can check it out on YouTube. There's a lot of good stuff. But that's just the Coles notes. And when we're in fight, flight, or freeze, historically, when we were in the Neanderthal stage, right, and running from saber-toothed tigers and et cetera, we had to have that part of our brain shut off, or else we'd be sitting there with the saber tooth running at us, and we're sitting there analyzing it. What color is this cat? How big is it? Is it going to get me? Can I? We're starting to analyze, right? You can't analyze in a life-threatening situation. You just got to fight, flight, or play dead, right? That is the three primary behaviors that we do. So when we look at sort of you brought up the sort of the case of the pathways of toxic masculinity that's really deconstructed our matrilineal systems that are the primary foundation for most of our Indigenous communities. This colonization of our men and our women have resulted in sort of the deconstruction of traditional roles. And so when anger is the most socially acceptable emotion, believe it or not, how messed up is that, right?
Yeah, very messed up.
Yeah. And so now you have people like Donald Trump, angry, hurtful, doesn't care, and yet he's being uplifted, right? So that's a really good example of how backward this society has become. And I'm just waiting for Indigenous people to sort of take the lead and be given that, afforded that space to get into these places of healing and leading those discussions, because that's where we're gonna get somewhere. We're gonna really get somewhere. But the whole emotional aspect, we have to understand and be very self-aware in everything that we do as a human being, not just in our big roles that we're fortunate to have, but as human beings. And when I look at some of our people, and our activists and our frontline, we need those people. No doubt about that. We need them. It's a whole chain that we work together from the academics to the front lines. We know that. You and I have been a part of that for a long time.
Yeah.
And since like 2006, right? When we had U.S.A. But oftentimes what I'm noticing is sometimes because our people are still working through their decolonization and healing or even getting on a healing path, there can often be a lot of emotional based behavior in those spaces, in all of our spaces, of course. And this is a human thing. This isn't an Indigenous thing. This is a human problem, right? It's in every institution. Emotional based behavior is damaging. It's not being talked about enough. So people are actively in spaces operating from fight, flight, or freeze. So when you think about the front lines and our protesters and activists staying in the fight, right? Constant fight, that's going to wear down their nervous system. That's actually going to have an impact on the body. This is why we have high rates of death of and diseases, because emotions and stress kills. And again, please, everybody go to YouTube and research why that is the case. But our bodies do a lot of things when we get emotional. We get tense, our arteries shrink, therefore our oxygen doesn't get to our brain. That just starts a whole chain of events that causes tons of issues in our body physically, just at a physical level, right? So we have to actually connect our emotional health to our physical health because that's been ignored. Our When we look at those emotions, like you said, being expressed, we started taking on the colonizers' views of what it meant to be a man, what it meant to be a woman, right? And those don't fit for us. They don't make us balanced. We don't feel good in those spaces. We feel good when we're connected, like you mentioned, connection and relationship, right? That's when we find peace. That's when we find our homeostasis, our windows of tolerance, all those good things. We feel connected, and we got to navigate those colonial spaces too. But emotions are so important because, again, when you're in the fight, you may not be in your rational mind all the time. So we've got to check that. And we don't want people to get hurt. The goal of living from an Itsitapi way is walk where you don't hurt yourself or hurt others, right? And that's really the goal. How do we have diplomatic, spaces in our own communities to start? Think about a band meeting. I don't know if you've been to a band meeting on a First Nation around Canada. It's good times, good times. You show up and it's like emotion. There's
Yeah.
so much emotion. It's anger, it's blame, it's guilt, it's shame, it's just all the negative emotions. How do we get to a space to get emotionally grounded that we can actually communicate to each other, that we're
Yeah.
communicating in a healthy way where we're not hurting each other and people feel safe to show up in spaces? So we still have
Yeah.
a long way to go for this. And I do want to work with our frontline community because they do amazing work and they need support too.
Yeah, thank you for that. It's a difficult topic, and I think we really need to address, like you said, toxic masculinities, different ways that emotions can be expressed that can take us away from those connections that are so vibrant to our health and well-being. And yeah, this is a really these I would say this is one of the front lines that are often neglected or missed because people are so busy doing the work that they don't realize the way in which you do the work is so valuable and so important. And it's going to be the way you get sustained, right, over time. How can you avoid burnout? And how do you avoid, being toxic maybe in a protest or in a land protection?
I mean, the lady, I think it was in Manitoba, I don't know if she was a grand chief who, collapsed to her death and
Yeah.
and during her work. right? I know so many people who've gone this way, and they're stressed to the max, carrying the people, fighting for the people. But who's taking care of them? We forgot ourselves. We forgot ourselves. We're focused so much on what we need to do because we have so much emergency and crisis, and we get stuck in that mindset. But we can't operate from that paradigm. It just will continue to never cease, and we have to slow down. These issues aren't going anywhere. Okay, these
No.
issues are not going anywhere, but we are. We're not gonna be around to do this work. So we gotta slow down and bring it back home, bring it right back to your table, your kids, your family, yourself. Bring it right back into the home and work on that first. That has to be the platform we're launching our work from. That spiritual and that connected and that relational and community space. But if we're out there alone, fight, 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 the body can't sustain that. The spirit can't sustain that. And there's some solid people who are doing all of it right. They're doing the ceremony, they're getting their protection, they're don't maybe they're going to counseling, maybe they're just talking to elders, but they're getting it out there. They're forming groups. Like I said, the Men Sweat Lodge, right? In our Blackfoot way, men sweat alone. That's our way, the Orthodox practice. I know many have changed and added different practices, but that's the way it was given to us and instructed. Because women don't have to do those things. We're already equipped with our cleansing, our life-giving powers. In our Blackfoot culture and a lot of other cultures out there, the women are perceived as higher powers. The men have to do a lot of work to get up to our level, to have a lot of tools to just be as power at the power we are. So we recognize that, and that's not a feminist perspective. A feminism is, it's a white person thing. That's not something I can identify with because my history was interrupted, but we are the original. We know who we are as women, right? But just as we need our men to heal, we need our women to heal. It's not one or the other, but we all need this healing because we're going to keep repeating these cycles of intergenerational trauma unless we do some real, in way to stop and put a stop to these behaviors. And I work with trauma every day in our communities. I work with our people who are literally expressing the symptoms of being colonized and being oppressed. And we have to work through that. And it takes a lot of work and time to do that. But I see the change. You see it when the light bulb goes off. You see it when they're excited. You see that woman coming in. She's looking good, feeling good. The man, he's got some nice clothes on. He's feeling good. You see when they start to feel good, right? You see that change. And to me, this is the most powerful work I've ever been privileged to do. Bigger than, I feel like I'm actually doing something, right? Versus all my other systemic work I've done. This is where I feel I'm actually impacting someone, and it is at the front lines.
As a couple of closing questions, I love the big questions. I guess I do like the big conceptual questions. But you've really outlined what the front lines are, and really in a clear way. So I'm gonna kind of go a different route and say, what does life beyond the state look like for you? And I kind of got hints when I was at the Buffalo ceremony, of what that might look like. But and the signing of the Buffalo Treaty, this past year. But what does that look like for you, especially when we're talking about some of these struggles that are continuing, but also the ways in which we're asserting our self-determining authority as First Nations, as Indigenous peoples?
I think for me, I feel very content at this point in my life. I've been through a lot of struggle to get here, a lot of institutional battles, even just to become a psychologist, just to survive my education, right? I was the only brown person in my cohort. You can imagine how fun that was, right?
Oh.
And how much I had to battle, how much of a threat people felt with me being there. And I went through hell. I had people write me letters, and it was just shocking. I really messed them up just by being there. just by having a voice, just by saying, hey, this isn't the only way to do psychology. Hey, I don't believe in this shit. Hey, this is oppressive. And these were born out of privileged white male, middle class, minds. And it was such a threat, right? And you can imagine how fun that was for me. And I had a newborn baby and da 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 da. There's just lots going on. So I had to carry so much going through these procedures and these things in life. And now I'm just like, whew, I just want to sit back and I want to go in my kayak and I want to go hike these mountains and I want to go to a ceremony, want to go to a movie, hang out with my friends. There's not a whole lot I really need to do. I feel pretty content, but I do know that I always, since I was in leadership back in 2011 to 15, for my tribe, I realized how small and insignificant I am. And I needed that because the core virtue of our way of life as Blackfoots is humility, to be humble. And there's a real reason for that because there's too much chiefs in the kitchen, everybody who thinks they're a chief and everybody's got the answers and and that's a sign of mental health issues, right? Of to think I'm so smart and significant that I have all the answers and you better listen to me, right? It's a bit delusional. It's not realistic. So I took that off myself. I took that pressure off and I'm just a human. I'm just a mom, right? I'm just mom. And I like my cat and da 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 da. Very simple. I don't look at myself the way other people look at me. And it kind of freaks me out when people look at me in a certain way. I'm like, please don't put me up there. Don't put me on that pedestal. I don't want to be there. I've fallen a few times and it's not good. I've learned my lessons, right? But that humility really conquers the ego. And I think my hopes for the future is to get colonization in the DSM, is to get racism as a delusionary disorder, right? To get a lot of these things in place, to rewrite history basically for psychology, but just to be a little part of that, because I know all of our Indigenous psychologists are doing their thing. They're all amazing. They've all worked hard to get there. People like yourself, and I have faith that that I've done enough work in this lifetime that I can just, whatever I do is going to be, it's going to be nice. It's going to be great. I'll contribute, but I'm not looking at myself that I have all the answers. I'm just one cog in the wheel. And that's a good place to be, right? Because I've been on the other side where I thought I knew everything and I had to be humbled. And it's actually a safe place to be, in a humility place, because you don't expect too much from yourself. You've done enough work. I can value what I've done. And, but now I get to, if I want to get creative in a certain area, I have the space to do that.
Yeah. Yeah. And humility is a cornerstone for Cherokees as well. And it's such an important teaching because, especially to keep you grounded in places like academia, where, thought and ideas are elevated to this unrealistic and crazy level of almost hero worship, it's like you said, it's a delusion. There's a reason I talk about how there's a reason why no one person in our community has all the knowledge, right? We all have little bits and pieces. There's no one person you go to and say, hey, I've got he or she's got the answer to everything. You have to go to everyone. And so it's dispersed. It's never concentrated in just one person. And we're all valuable in that community setting. But yeah, thank you for that. Last question is there anything we didn't talk about that you'd like to talk about, or maybe things you'd like to revisit that you made earlier?
I thought about that question, and of course, I always want to talk about, our women, our children, our young people. Shout out to our young people, because I hear a lot of elders mention that, oh, they're so soft and they're this and they're that. And I'm like, no, they're actually feeling with their full emotional self. They're actually healing, and they're expressing and communicating. And God, I wish I had that when I was a kid. You know, I wish I was surrounded in a space, safe spaces. So we've actually manifested the children we wanted because parents have done the work, you know. And I know that's not a blanket statement, it's a hit and miss, but our kids are so powerful, and they're the closest to the spirit world than us, right? They've just come from there not long ago. So they carry that energy and that space, that knowledge. And on top of that, in decolonized spaces, like I never thought I'd hear kids talk about decolonization on TikTok and all these reels. I'm just like, wow, this is crazy, because we've been talking decolonization for decades, right? And so to hear it at the masses, and they're educating each other, I'm so proud. So we got to create these spaces for the kids. We've got to support them. We're getting up there, right? We've got to pass that torch. And I don't want to do that heavy lifting anymore. I can't. I don't have the energy, right? And so my priorities are family, community, prayer, etc. My meadow, my granddaughter you met. So I'm like, that's where I'm at right now. And that's just a natural part of my evolvement. So shout out to the kids. We got to find more ways to provide resources, because they are still struggling with high rates of suicide, still struggling with, the opioid deaths. It's very scary as well on those front lines. So I always want I am a child and youth advocate. I always believe to do that. We forget we were kids. We forget what it was like, and it was scary at times, and we needed the people we are now.
Thank you for that. That's such a beautiful way to close out our conversation. Yeah, I think of my daughter really taught me how to be a human being,
Right.
because they are the real human beings. And, we learn so much from them, and yet we sometimes dismiss what their teachings are or their value. Yeah, thank you for that. And really to honor these next generations that are going to be so strong for all of us, but also for our future nations.
We did a lot of hard work, Jeff, and now we're going to let the kids take it forward, and we can sit back and enjoy life a little bit more.
I like that. I like that thinking. Well, well, Wado, thank you so much, Angela. This has been wonderful. And like I said, we could have gone on for hours and hours. So thank you for taking the time today to speak with us, and very excited to see the work as it continues, and the conversations as they continue. So, Wado.
You bet. And in Blackfoot, we say, Gidadamatsin, until I see you again.
Similar in Cherokee. It's Donda Goahi, which means may the Creator be with you until our paths cross again.